The night was thick with fog, the kind that seemed to muffle every sound and obscure even the most familiar landmarks. In the stillness, an old car, a 1967 Ford Mustang, gleamed under the pale light of a flickering street lamp, its chrome and metal almost appearing as though it had never aged. Mason, a young mechanic with a passion for restoring classic cars, had stumbled upon the Mustang at a junkyard a few weeks earlier. Its condition was surprisingly good, considering it had been abandoned for years, and he couldn't resist the urge to bring it back to life. He spent every night working on the car, pouring his heart and soul into every detail, until the Mustang looked as if it had just rolled off the assembly line. But as the restoration neared completion, strange things began to happen in Mason's garage. Tools would go missing, only to be found in strange places or arranged in peculiar patterns on the workbench. The radio, which Mason had never bothered to fix, would crackle to life late at night, playing songs from a bygone era that seemed to echo through the empty garage. Mason dismissed these occurrences as mere coincidences, the byproduct of exhaustion and long hours spent in the dim light of the workshop. But one evening, as he was tightening the last bolt on the engine, the temperature in the garage plummeted and a chill ran down his spine. He looked up to see the faint outline of a figure in the Mustang's driver's seat, a shadowy presence that seemed to be watching him intently. The figure was there for only a moment, but it left behind a feeling of unease that Mason couldn't shake. Ignoring the gnawing sense of dread, Mason decided it was time to take the Mustang for a test drive. He slid into the driver's seat, feeling the worn leather beneath him, and turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life with a deep, throaty growl that sent vibrations through the entire car. Mason grinned, but his smile quickly faded as the Mustang's headlights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the garage walls. He chalked it up to an electrical glitch and shifted the car into gear, rolling out of the garage and onto the dark, deserted road. The night was eerily quiet, the fog wrapping around the car like a shroud as Mason drove through the empty streets. As he reached the outskirts of town, the fog grew thicker, and the road seemed to stretch on forever, with no signs of civilization in sight. The radio, silent since he'd started the drive, suddenly crackled to life, playing an old, haunting melody that Mason had never heard before. The car's headlights flickered again, and for a brief moment, Mason thought he saw figures standing along the roadside, their eyes glowing like embers in the darkness. He shook his head, trying to focus on the road, but the figures kept appearing, each one closer than the last. Panic began to creep in as Mason realized he was no longer in control of the car. The steering wheel seemed to move on its own, guiding the Mustang down a winding, unfamiliar path that twisted and turned in ways that defied logic. The fog grew thicker still, until Mason could barely see a few feet in front of the car. The radio's eerie melody grew louder, almost deafening, as the road beneath the car transformed into a narrow, crumbling bridge suspended over a black abyss. Mason's knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel, desperately trying to regain control, but the car seemed to have a mind of its own. The bridge swayed and creaked under the weight of the Mustang, the planks beneath the tires cracking and splintering with each passing second. Suddenly, the car skidded to a stop in the middle of the bridge, the engine sputtering and dying as the headlights flickered one last time before plunging the world into darkness. The radio fell silent, and all that remained was the sound of Mason's ragged breathing and the creaking of the bridge beneath him. The temperature inside the car dropped even further, and Mason could see his breath in the frigid air. he felt a presence behind him, a cold, malevolent force that seemed to press down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He didn't dare turn around, but he could sense the figure from the garage, now sitting in the back seat, its eyes boring into him through the rearview mirror. The car's doors locked with a click, trapping Mason inside with the entity that had taken over the Mustang. The bridge groaned and shifted, the planks beneath the car beginning to give way, and Mason knew he had to act fast. He fumbled for the ignition, desperately trying to restart the engine, but the key wouldn't turn, as if something was holding it in place. The bridge lurched again, and Mason felt the car begin to tip, the front end dipping precariously toward the abyss below. He slammed his foot on the brake, but the pedal went straight to the floor, unresponsive and useless. In a last-ditch effort, Mason reached for the door handle, but it was ice cold to the touch and wouldn't budge, no matter how hard he pulled. The figure in the backseat leaned closer, its presence suffocating, and Mason could hear a low, guttural whisper that seemed to emanate from all around him. The bridge gave one final, violent shudder, and the car plunged forward, the front wheels slipping off the edge. Mason's scream was lost in the roar of the wind as the Mustang tumbled into the darkness, the world spinning around him in a blur of fog and shadows. But just as quickly as the car had fallen, it came to a sudden, jarring stop. Mason was thrown forward, his head slamming into the steering wheel, and everything went black. When he came to, he found himself still in the driver's seat, the car parked neatly in front of his garage as if nothing had happened. The fog had lifted, and the night was clear, the stars twinkling overhead in the crisp, cold air. Mason's hands trembled as he fumbled for the door handle, and this time, it opened easily, the cold metal giving way beneath his touch. He stumbled out of the car, his legs shaking, and backed away from the Mustang, his heart pounding in his chest. The garage door was open, the warm light spilling out onto the driveway, but Mason couldn't bring himself to step inside. He turned to look at the Mustang one last time, its polished surface gleaming under the street lamp. But something had changed. The car no longer looked like the sleek, powerful machine he had spent weeks restoring. The paint was chipped and faded, the chrome dull and rusted, and the once pristine interior was now tattered and worn, as if it had aged decades in the span of a few hours. Mason's breath caught in his throat as he noticed something else, a faint outline of a handprint on the driver's side window, the glass fogging slightly from the cold. The handprint was too small to be his own, the fingers long and slender, the outline blurred as if it had been there for years. A chill ran down Mason's spine, and he turned and ran, leaving the Mustang and the garage behind. He didn't stop until he reached his house, slamming the door behind him and locking it tight. For days, Mason refused to return to the garage, the memory of that night haunting him every time he closed his eyes. But curiosity got the better of him, and one evening, he found himself standing outside the garage door, the keys to the Mustang clutched tightly in his hand. He hesitated for a long moment before finally unlocking the door and stepping inside. The garage was just as he had left it, the tools neatly arranged on the workbench, the floor swept clean. But the Mustang was gone. In its place was an old, rusted frame, the remnants of a car that had long since been forgotten. The tires were flat, the engine missing, and the interior gutted, leaving nothing but a shell of what once was. Mason stared at the wreckage in disbelief, his mind racing to make sense of what he was seeing. He reached out to touch the car, but pulled his hand back at the last moment, the memory of that cold, malevolent presence still fresh in his mind. He never spoke of the Mustang again, and the townspeople eventually forgot about the young mechanic and his obsession with restoring classic cars. But on certain nights, when the fog rolls in thick and heavy, some say you can still hear the distant roar of an engine and the haunting melody of an old song echoing through the streets. And if you're unlucky enough to find yourself on the Phantom Road, you might just catch a glimpse of a 1967 Ford Mustang, its headlights flickering as it speeds by, a shadowy figure behind the wheel.